So imagine a nation that practically eradicated child mortality, right?
Yeah.
And they wiped out this crushing national debt in just a single decade.
Which is incredibly rare.
Exactly. And on top of that, they're sitting on one of the greatest untapped gold mines of solar energy on Earth. So on paper, it looks like this absolute miracle of modern development.
Right. It looks like a total success story.
But, and here's the hook for you today,
Mm.
if you look under the hood, this exact same nation is quietly liquidating its own future just to pay for today's lunch.
It really is the ultimate paradox of resource wealth. I mean, you have this massive structural facade that looks totally impenetrable from the outside.
Yeah.
But the internal load-bearing walls are, they're actually starting to buckle under the weight of these shifting global realities.
And that tension is exactly what we are tearing into today. Welcome to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, and joined as always by a resident data expert.
Great to be here.
So today, we are looking at Algeria, this massive North African powerhouse. And we aren't just looking at, like, a quick snapshot of what's happening there right now.
No, not at all.
We have our hands on this staggering World Bank academic analysis report. We're talking about a data pool of over 1,400 distinct indicators.
1,400, it's massive.
Right. Tracking everything. Macroeconomic shifts, human capital, environmental sustainability, governance. And it covers this sweeping timeline from 1960 all the way to 2023.
Yeah, more than half a century of data, which I have to say is incredibly rare to see synthesized in one place like this.
Because usually they're all split up.
Exactly. Usually development reports silo these metrics. The economists look at the GDP, the sociologists look at education rates, and the climatologists look at carbon emissions.
Right, they never talk to each other.
Exactly. But this data set forces us to overlay them. It forces us to see how a nation's financial wealth, its biological health, and its institutional rigidity are completely inextricably linked.
So if you are analyzing emerging markets, or if you're just fascinated by how a country actually builds itself from the ground up, consider this deep dive your ultimate shortcut.
It really is.
We're going beyond just the raw numbers to understand the mechanics of a nation transitioning from a newly independent state in the 60s into this modern, heavily resource-dependent economy.
Facing some massive demographic shifts, too.
Yes, exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the sheer, just blinding velocity of the money here. Let's look at the macroeconomic growth, because the visual representation of this data is, well, it's jarring.
Jarring is definitely the correct word. If you chart Algeria's gross national income, or GNI, over this 60-year period, it honestly defies standard growth models.
How so?
Well, in 1960, the nominal GNI was roughly $3.2 billion.
Okay, so $3.2 billion.
Yeah.
Which is a relatively small baseline for a country of that geographic size, right?
Very small, yeah. But by 2023, that number had ballooned to nearly $264.2 billion.
Wow, I want to pause on that scale for a second for the listener. Going from $3.2 billion to over $264 billion?
It's an exponential explosion.
Yeah, that isn't just normal growth. That is a fundamental recategorization of a country's purchasing power on the global stage.
It is. But, and this is key, the trajectory to get there wasn't some smooth upward slope. The data actually shows a very distinct, almost violent pattern.
Right, like a roller coaster.
Exactly. Throughout the 1990s, the economy was kind of trapped on this low, stagnant plateau. It was a period of really severe macroeconomic distress.
Right.
But then right around crossing into the 2000s, the chart just shows this aggressive vertical upswing. The scale of the economy completely changes in this remarkably compressed time frame.
So I'm looking at this hockey stick curve right after the year 2000. And I mean, knowing the region, I have to assume this isn't because they suddenly invented the iPhone.
No, definitely not.
This curve has to track directly with the global price of crude oil and natural gas, right?
All right. Almost to the decimal point. The nominal economic expansion is just inextricably tethered to hydrocarbons. When global energy markets boom, Algeria's top-line macroeconomic numbers just explode.
Okay, but we have to separate, like, nominal state wealth from actual day-to-day human welfare.
Absolutely.
Because a massive GNI figure doesn't inherently mean the average citizen walking down the street is experiencing a, a commensurate rise in their standard of living.
Right, the money doesn't always reach the ground. To see that, we have to look at the per capita GNI. And crucially, we have to adjust it for inflation using constant prices.
Okay, to strip away the illusion of inflation.
Exactly. It shows us actual real purchasing power over time. So in 1960, that real per capita figure was about $230.
$230, okay.
Yeah, and by the 2020s, it had grown to roughly $5,000.
Okay, wait. Going from $230 to $5,000 over 60 years is, it's undeniable progress, yes.
It is.
But it completely breaks from the trajectory of the national wealth we just talked about. The total economy exploded by a factor of over 80.
Right.
But the per capita wealth grew at a fraction of that velocity. It looks less like a rocket ship and more like a slow, bumpy wagon trail.
Yeah, and that discrepancy introduces one of the most vital concepts we look at in development economics, which is resource rent distribution.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that. Because if the national bank account is swelling by hundreds of billions of dollars, why does the wealth generated by a barrel of oil fail to translate into the pocket of the citizen at the same rate?
It all comes down to how the wealth is physically generated. Think about it. If a country builds its economy on manufacturing, say, automotive assembly or textiles, that process requires millions of human beings.
Right, you need workers.
Exactly. You need factory line workers, logistics managers, quality control inspectors, port operators.
That's a whole ecosystem.
Yeah, and the revenue generated by selling those cars or those clothes is distributed back through the population via wages. The wealth creation is inherently labor-intensive.
So the money touches thousands of hands before it ever reaches the government via income taxes.
Precisely. But extracting hydrocarbons is the exact opposite. It is heavily capital-intensive, but not labor-intensive at all.
Meaning you just need machines.
Pretty much. You need a highly specialized, relatively small crew of engineers and massive heavy machinery to pull $1 billion worth of oil out of the ground.
Right.
And the revenue from selling that oil bypasses the broader labor market entirely and goes directly into the central government's coffers. This is what economists call a rent.
Okay, so the state basically becomes this incredibly wealthy bottleneck.
Yes.
All the money is bottlenecked at the top, and then the government has to, actively figure out how to push that money down to the population.
And historically speaking, relying on the state to efficiently distribute massive windfalls of cash, especially without a diversified private sector, is just fraught with friction.
I can imagine.
The state might try to distribute the wealth by subsidizing basic goods, or maybe creating these bloated public sector jobs. But those mechanisms don't create compounding, sustainable wealth for the individual.
It's a fascinating structural flaw, honestly. It's kind of like looking at a company where, let's say, an automated software generates $1 billion in profit, but the company only has 10 employees.
That's a great analogy.
The company's valuation is astronomical, but the surrounding town doesn't benefit from thousands of new jobs. The wealth is just hyper-localized at the point of extraction.
Which forces us to ask this really critical question. If the distribution mechanisms are that inefficient, what is Algeria actually building with all this wealth?
Right. If they aren't employing millions in manufacturing, what does their actual industrial sector look like?
Well, let's dig into the manufacturing data, because this is where the vulnerability becomes really glaring. When we look at the share of the economy dedicated to manufacturing value added, meaning the actual processing of raw materials into finished sellable goods, it is essentially flatlining.
Completely flat.
Over a 60-year period, yeah. Where the total GNI was just exploding, the manufacturing sector saw almost zero structural breakthrough.
That's wild. So even as the economic pie grew massively, manufacturing failed to scale with it.
It remains an alarmingly marginal slice of the pie. And to understand just how dangerous this is, the report utilizes some brilliant Sankey diagrams to visualize the trade data.
Oh, I love Sankey diagrams. For any listeners unfamiliar, a Sankey diagram is basically a flow chart where the width of the arrows represents the volume of the flow.
Right.
They look kind of like rivers. You can see exactly what goods are flowing out of a country and exactly where they are going.
And Algeria's trade river is this massive torrent flowing almost exclusively in one direction, carrying one very specific type of cargo.
Let me guess. Oil.
Oil and natural gas. The data shows that between 80% to 95% of Algeria's exports go directly to high-income economies, predominantly in Europe. And those exports are overwhelmingly raw, unrefined hydrocarbons.
Almost zero diversification.
Exactly.
Wait, let me challenge the danger of that for a second.
Mm.
If you have a customer base of highly wealthy European nations who desperately need energy, right?
Sure.
And you happen to sit literally right across the Mediterranean Sea from them, isn't that just incredible geographic good luck? Why is that such a massive vulnerability?
Because of a pretty devastating macroeconomic phenomenon known as Dutch disease.
Dutch disease.
Yeah.
Okay, walk us through the actual mechanics of that. How does selling oil in Europe destroy a factory in Algiers?
It all happens through the currency exchange rate. So when Algeria sells billions of dollars of gas to Europe, those European buyers pay in euros or dollars,
Right.
which then have to be converted into Algerian dinars by the central bank. This massive constant demand for the dinar artificially drives up its value on the global market.
Okay, so the local currency becomes incredibly strong. That sounds like a good thing at first.
It does, until you try to sell anything else. Now imagine a local Algerian entrepreneur who wants to build a textile factory to export shirts.
Okay.
Because the dinar is so highly valued thanks to all that oil money, the cost of paying local workers and running the factory in dinars makes the final price of that shirt incredibly expensive when it's priced in dollars or euros for export.
Oh, I see. So mathematically, a buyer in London looks at the Algerian shirt and then looks at a shirt manufactured in, say, Vietnam.
Exactly.
And in Vietnam, the currency hasn't been artificially inflated by oil,
Yeah.
so the Vietnamese shirt is half the price.
Exactly. The strong currency renders every other potential export globally uncompetitive, so the textile factory goes bankrupt.
Wow.
And capital and talent quickly realize that the only profitable sector in the entire country is the oil sector. So all investment flows there, starving other industries.
It's like an athlete who only ever trains their right arm.
Yeah.
Sure, your right arm, the oil sector, is incredibly strong. But your left arm, manufacturing, is completely atrophied because the oil arm is hoarding all the blood flow.
And beyond the currency issue, there's a severe geopolitical threat to this specific trade river.
Right, because if 80 to 95% of your exports are carbon-heavy fossil fuels going to Europe, you are staring down the barrel of Europe's massive decarbonization mandates.
That is the existential threat the data really highlights. The European Union is aggressively implementing things like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism.
Which is essentially a tariff on carbon-intensive imports, right?
Exactly. Algeria's entire economic engine is completely exposed to the environmental legislation of its primary customer.
If the European market actually pivots to renewables and actively penalizes carbon, that massive 80% trade river just dries up.
Evaporates.
And because of Dutch disease, there is no backup manufacturing sector ready to take its place. The entire system is built on this single, highly vulnerable pillar.
Which makes the urgency of economic diversification not just some talking point for optimization, it's a matter of absolute national survival.
But let me play devil's advocate here again. We are looking at a 60-year data set, right?
We are.
And the oil market is notoriously cyclical. We've seen prices crash into the basement in the 80s, the late 90s, 2014.
Oh, yeah, massive crashes.
If Algeria is this hyper-dependent on hydrocarbons, how have they not gone completely bankrupt during the bust years? Usually, resource-dependent nations get caught in horrific sovereign debt traps. They borrow heavily when oil is high, and then they default when the price inevitably crashes.
You are hitting on one of the most remarkable and frankly counterintuitive data points in the entire World Bank Report.
Really?
Yeah. To understand how they survived, we have to examine their financial shield, specifically their management of national external debt.
Because in the 1990s, their debt numbers looked apocalyptic.
They were. Algeria's external debt stock was sitting at over 60% of their total gross national income.
Over 60%. Just to clarify what that means in reality for the listener. More than half of the value of every single thing the country produced in a year would be required just to cover the principal of what they owed to foreign creditors.
It was a suffocating macroeconomic burden. When a nation is that deeply leveraged, it actually loses its geopolitical sovereignty.
Because the banks are in charge.
Exactly. Creditors, international monetary institutions, they essentially take the steering wheel of your domestic policy because you require their constant bailouts just to keep the lights on.
So how on earth does a country escape a 60% debt to GNI ratio without entirely collapsing?
This is where we return to that violent, vertical upswing in oil prices right after the year 2000. Algeria experienced this massive, unprecedented windfall of foreign currency.
But history shows us that when petrostates get a windfall, They usually squander it, right?
Oh, almost always.
They build massive, useless vanity projects, or they implement wild populist spending programs just to keep the citizens happy.
And that is exactly what Algeria did not do, at least initially. The data shows a period of rigorous, highly disciplined financial management.
Really?
Yeah. Instead of pouring the entirety of that boom into domestic consumption, the state aggressively liquidated its foreign debt. They systematically paid off their external creditors.
I'm looking at the timeline here. By the 2010s, that 60% debt stock had plummeted to below 3%.
Below 3% is effectively zero in sovereign debt terms.
Yeah.
It is a stunning deleveraging.
Wait, I have to push back on the reality of that.
Yeah.
Dropping your national debt by nearly 57 percentage points in a decade requires diverting hundreds of billions of dollars away from the domestic economy and sending it to foreign banks.
It does.
Usually when the government does that, when they implement that level of financial austerity, the citizens riot.
Yeah.
How did they achieve this without tearing the social fabric of the country apart?
Because it wasn't true austerity in the sense of cutting existing social programs. It was an opportunity cost.
Oh, I see.
They used the new wealth from the oil boom to clear the books. It was a strategic decision to prioritize macroeconomic security over immediate, hyperinflated domestic growth.
Rather.
And they didn't just pay down debt. They funneled excess revenues into a massive stabilization fund, building up incredible foreign exchange reserves.
I build a fortress.
They built an absolute financial fortress. It is a textbook example of utilizing volatile resource rents to purchase national sovereignty.
Right.
By clearing their external ledgers, they ensured that when the inevitable oil price crashes occurred, like that really severe drop in 2014, they wouldn't be at the mercy of the IMF or foreign bondholders. They could weather the storm using their own savings.
Okay, but this reveals a massive, glaring paradox in the data.
What's that?
If they successfully eliminated their debt burden, they freed up massive amounts of cash flow. They no longer had to pay crushing interest rates to foreign banks every month.
Yeah.
So logically, they should have taken all that freed up capital and poured it directly into fixing the manufacturing sector we just talked about. They should have cured the Dutch disease. Why didn't that happen?
And that is the tragedy of the data set. What's fascinating here is they achieved supreme macro-financial stability, but it did not translate into structural economic transformation.
Wow.
The state balanced its books impeccably, but the internal machinery of the domestic economy remained entirely rigid.
Because having a massive, secure savings account doesn't inherently mean you know how to build a dynamic new business.
Precisely. The state proved it could protect its wealth from external creditors, but it failed to develop the mechanisms required to invest that wealth into complex, diversified domestic production.
Which means we need to look away from the macro ledgers and focus on the actual population.
Yes.
If the state is stockpiling foreign reserves and balancing the books, what is happening to the human beings on the ground? What is the human element of this data?
When we transition to the human capital indicators, we actually see some of the most profound victories in late 20th century development. Let's start with raw biological survival.
The child mortality data here it's haunting and then incredibly uplifting at the same time.
It really is. If you look at the 1960 baseline, the under 5 child mortality rate was catastrophic. Over 240 deaths per 1,000 births.
I want to make sure the weight of that number lands for you listening. We are talking about nearly a quarter of all children born in this nation failing to see their 5th birthday.
It's staggering.
The sheer volume of grief required for a society to absorb that kind of loss is unimaginable.
It is a devastating baseline. But if you track the single indicator through the decades, you witness a monumental triumph of public policy.
The rate just plummets.
It plummets. Today, that number sits at roughly 21 deaths per 1,000 births. And the data shows the slope of that decline accelerating heavily right around the year 2000.
There's that year 2000 again. The oil boom.
Yes. This is where we have to give the rentier state credit. The wealth did not build a competitive manufacturing sector, no. But it was mobilized with incredible efficacy to build biological infrastructure.
Wait, but dropping infant mortality, that drastically isn't just about throwing money at a problem. Geographically, Algeria is massive, and a huge portion of it is the Sahara Desert.
Right.
You can't just build a pristine hospital in Algiers and expect child mortality to drop nationwide. How did they actually achieve this across such difficult terrain?
It required a logistical miracle, honestly. The state utilized its centralized power and that resource wealth to roll out systematic immunization campaigns.
Okay.
But vaccines require cold chain storage, which requires widespread electrification.
Okay.
It required the massive expansion of clean drinking water and sanitation infrastructure into remote rural provinces.
Wow.
This wasn't just healthcare, it was heavy civil engineering directed specifically at human survival.
So they use the oil wealth to keep their citizens alive. That is the fundamental prerequisite for any economic development.
Exactly. And they moved beyond mere survival into basic human development, specifically regarding education.
What do the numbers say there?
The data tracks primary school graduation rates, which stabilized well above 90% and in some years touched near 100%.
So effectively universal primary education.
Yes. But the most striking demographic shift within that education data is the vertical spike in female youth literacy.
Oh, wow.
The historical gender gap in basic literacy was aggressively, intentionally narrowed. You now have an entire generation of young Algerian women who can read, write, and engage intellectually in ways that were systemically denied to their grandmothers.
And we absolutely must celebrate that. Wiping out 1960s-level child mortality and putting nearly every child in a classroom is a staggering achievement.
It is.
But as we dig deeper into the World Bank's evaluation of that education, a massive red flag emerges.
It does. The data set introduces a critical, somewhat sobering metric termed learning poverty.
Learning poverty. That implies that simply being inside a school building does not equal acquiring knowledge.
That is the crux of the issue. The data shows that while physical attendance and basic graduation rates are almost universal, the quality of the pedagogy is severely lagging.
So they're passing the tests, but
the education system is failing to translate basic literacy into the high-level, specialized cognitive skills required to power a modern, globally competitive workforce.
let me make sure I'm understanding the gravity of this. They achieved the logistical feat of building the schools and getting the kids to sit at the desks.
Right.
But if learning poverty is high, are we essentially just warehousing students? Are we handing them a piece of paper that says they graduated, but failing to give them the actual, say, software engineering or advanced logistics skills they need to rebuild that atrophied manufacturing sector we desperately need?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the structural metaphor here is critical. Imagine the state spent billions building a state-of-the-art commercial-grade kitchen.
Okay.
They bought the best ovens, imported the finest stainless steel prep stations, and filled the room with people. That is the basic health and education infrastructure.
But if they suffer from learning poverty?
Then they only taught the people in that kitchen how to boil water.
Oof.
They have the physical infrastructure to run a Michelin star restaurant, but they lack the specialized culinary training to actually produce a complex menu.
That perfectly illustrates the problem.
They have basic human capital, but they lack the advanced human capital required to transition an economy away from digging oil out of the ground to designing microprocessors or managing complex global supply chains.
So you have this massive population of young people, particularly young women, who survived childhood, learned to read, and graduated high school. They are sitting in the kitchen.
Right.
But what happens when they try to leave the classroom and enter the actual workforce?
That brings us to what the data highlights as a profound systemic failure, the missing half of the economic equation. We have to look at gender and societal integration.
And the numbers here are incredibly jarring. Despite this historical vertical leap in female literacy, meaning there are millions of highly capable, educated women ready to contribute, the female labor force participation rate remains stubbornly, drastically low.
Yeah. For women over the age of 15, participation in the formal labor market trails significantly behind global averages and even lags behind regional averages for the broader Middle East and North Africa.
Why? I mean, if the state spent billions educating these women, why are they not generating economic output? Are there explicit legal bans preventing them from working?
It is much more complex than a single law. The report uses the Women, Business, and the Law Index to quantify this.
Okay, the WBL index.
Right. This index measures how laws and regulations impact women's economic opportunities. Algeria scores a 57.5 out of 100.
Which is a failing grade by any standard metric.
It indicates deep structural friction. While there has been progress in political integration, like the data shows women's parliamentary seats have trended upwards, the economic barriers remain deeply entrenched.
So they can be in parliament, but they can't easily start a business.
Exactly. And these barriers aren't always a neon sign saying women cannot apply. Often, it is logistical and cultural infrastructure.
Give me an example of that friction.
Hmm.
What actually stops an educated woman from taking a corporate job in Algiers?
Well, it can be a lack of safe, reliable public transportation specifically designed to protect female commuters.
Oh, logistics.
Right. Or it can be a complete absence of state-supported childcare, meaning the moment a woman has a child, she is culturally and logistically forced to exit the workforce.
Right, because someone has to watch the kid.
Exactly. It can also be complex property rights or inheritance laws that prevent women from securing the collateral needed to get a business loan in the first place.
So it's this invisible web of tripwires that make formal employment exhausting or just impossible to maintain.
Yes.
But let's look at this purely through the lens of macroeconomic survival for a second. If a nation is trying to cure Dutch disease, if they're trying to build an entirely new, diversified manufacturing and service economy from scratch, how can they possibly achieve that if they intentionally leave 50% of their talent pool sitting on the sidelines?
Mathematically, they cannot. It is akin to buying a multi-million-dollar supercomputer, plugging it in, and then intentionally disabling half of its processors before trying to run a complex simulation.
That's insane.
The economy is artificially starving itself of productivity.
And looking at the demographic data, they're running out of time to fix this.
The demographic window is rapidly closing. For decades, Algeria benefited from a massive youth bulge. This is known as a demographic dividend, a scenario where the working-age population vastly outnumbers the dependent population of children and the elderly.
Which is usually the perfect condition for explosive economic growth.
It is. But the data shows the birth rates have stabilized, and the population structure is shifting. The percentage of the population over the age of 65 is steadily climbing past 6%.
So they are transitioning from a high birth rate youth society into an aging society.
Yes, and this shifts the entire burden of the state. If you do not activate your youth, bulge specifically those educated women, and turn them into a formal, tax-paying, highly productive workforce right now.
You're going to face a catastrophic math problem in 20 years.
Exactly. Because you will end up with a relatively small formal workforce trying to generate enough tax revenue to pay for the pensions, healthcare, and infrastructure of a massive aging population.
Wow.
The ultimate fear for any developing nation is to grow old before you grow rich. If Algeria fails to bring women into the formal economy, the social security burden will eventually collapse the state's finances, regardless of how much oil they sell.
That is a terrifying ticking clock. But, I mean, even if we assume they solve this, even if they fix the education quality and fully integrate women into a booming new manufacturing sector, there is a physical planetary limit to this growth model.
Right, the environmental cost.
Exactly. They are generating the wealth to pay for all of this by pulling fossil fuels out of the earth. So let's look at the environmental data.
The environmental metrics present a stark, almost unresolvable paradox. As the Algerian economy has expanded, greenhouse gas emissions have climbed relentlessly.
As expected with industrialization.
Sure, but the most shocking data point is their energy mix. Fossil fuels account for nearly 100% of the country's domestic energy consumption.
Wait, I have to stop you. Almost 100%.
Almost entirely.
Algeria is geographically dominated by the Sahara Desert. They receive some of the highest, most intense solar irradiation of any landmass on planet Earth. How is their renewable energy share hovering near zero?
To understand why they are burning their own oil and gas to power their cities, instead of using the infinite sunshine hitting their deserts, we have to look at a highly sophisticated economic metric the World Bank uses called adjusted net savings.
Oh, I pored over this specific calculation in the report because it completely shatters the illusion of traditional GDP.
It really does.
Can you walk us through the exact math of how adjusted net savings is calculated? Because it's brilliant.
Absolutely. So traditional gross domestic product, GDP, simply measures the volume of transactions. If money changes hands, GDP goes up.
Right.
It doesn't care if you generated that money by inventing a new technology or by chopping down your last apple tree and selling the wood.
GDP just sees the cash register ringing.
Correct. But adjusted net savings attempts to measure the actual underlying wealth of a nation over time. It treats a country like a corporate balance sheet, not just an income statement.
So how does the formula work? Let's break it down.
Okay, it starts with national savings, the actual money the country is putting in the bank.
Makes sense.
Then it does something very progressive. It adds the national expenditure on education.
Oh, because education isn't a sunk cost. It's an investment in human capital. You are building future value.
Precisely. But then comes the brutal part of the formula. It begins to subtract.
Here we go.
It subtracts the depletion of energy resources. It subtracts the depletion of mineral resources. And finally, it subtracts the estimated economic damage caused by carbon dioxide emissions and particulate matter pollution.
This is such a profound shift in perspective. It treats natural resources as a finite inventory.
Exactly.
It's like if I own a furniture store and I sell a beautiful mahogany desk, I have more cash in the register today. My daily revenue looks great.
But you also have one less desk.
Exactly. I have one less desk in my inventory. My total net wealth hasn't actually increased. I simply liquidated an asset into cash.
That is the perfect analogy for Algeria's macroeconomic reality. When the World Bank applies the adjusted net savings calculation to this data, it reveals a terrifying truth hidden beneath the high GDP growth numbers.
What's the number?
In certain years, the depletion of their energy inventory alone eats up over 2% of their entire gross national income.
2% of the entire national wealth just vanishing into thin air as depleted inventory.
Yes, the high economic growth they're experiencing is, in a strictly mathematical sense, an illusion.
Wow.
It is not the creation of new compounding value. It is the rapid, aggressive liquidation of their natural capital. They are drawing down a finite savings account, the oil and gas buried under the Sahara, to pay for today's consumption.
They are literally selling off the family silver to pay for lunch.
And this introduces the concept of intergenerational equity. If the wealth of the nation is based entirely on a finite inventory, what are they leaving for the children born today?
Right, because once the oil is gone.
Or once the European market refuses to buy it due to climate legislation, the national bank account is empty and the environment is highly polluted.
Which brings us back to my question. Why aren't they building massive solar farms in the Sahara? If burning gas is destroying their long-term wealth and they have infinite sunshine, why is renewable energy at 0%? Are solar panels just too expensive to import?
No, it has nothing to do with the cost of solar panels. It has entirely to do with domestic political calculus.
What do you mean?
To keep the population pacified and simulate a high standard of living, the Algerian government heavily, artificially subsidizes domestic natural gas.
So electricity generated by gas is virtually free for the citizen.
Exactly. Because it is so artificially cheap, there is absolutely zero market incentive for a private company to come in and build a solar plant.
They could never compete.
The solar company could never compete with subsidized gas. The market signal is completely distorted by state intervention.
But surely the government planners see this data. I mean, they know the gas is finite. They know Europe is decarbonizing.
You would think so.
So why not just remove the subsidies, endure a few years of unpopularity, and pivot to solar? Why not reform the banking sector to let women get business loans? Why not strip away the red tape and cure the Dutch disease by building up domestic manufacturing? If the solutions are this obvious in the data, what is stopping them?
And that exact question brings us to the final and unequivocally most critical piece of the World Bank report. We have to examine the systemic governance and the institutional rigidity of the state.
The operating system of the country itself.
Exactly. The World Bank tracks this using the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI.
Okay, the WGI.
This index evaluates things like government effectiveness, rule of law, and crucially, the control of corruption.
Let's look at the hard numbers. How does Algeria score on governance?
On the specific metric of control of corruption, Algeria fluctuates stubbornly between the 20th and 40th percentile globally.
20th to 40th.
Okay. Furthermore, the improvement across this 60-year data set is painfully slow. Another critical metric, regulatory quality, is also consistently flagged as a severe vulnerability.
I know the World Bank has to maintain a level of diplomatic neutrality in their reports. They use highly sanitized academic terminology.
They do.
But let's translate this for you listening. Isn't ranking in the 20th to 40th percentile for control of corruption just an incredibly polite way of saying that the system is fundamentally broken for the average entrepreneur trying to start a business?
It implies an environment that is deeply opaque, highly bureaucratic, and controlled by informal gatekeepers. It suggests a system where arbitrary enforcement of rules and rent-seeking behavior by officials is just commonplace.
So if I am an entrepreneur in Algiers trying to open a logistics company, low regulatory quality means I might spend 2 years just trying to get the permits.
Paying bribes along the way.
Right, paying bribes along the way, only to be shut down by a sudden arbitrary change in the tax code.
And that reality is the ultimate bottleneck for the entire nation. It ties every single vulnerability we have discussed together.
Let's connect those dots. How does that stop the macroeconomy?
Well, think about it. Why is there no manufacturing diversification? Why hasn't the Dutch disease been cured?
Because no one wants to build there.
Because building a massive competitive manufacturing base requires high-quality foreign direct investment, FDI.
Right.
It requires global companies to come in and build factories.
Right.
But if a foreign corporation looks at the WGI index and sees a 20th percentile ranking in corruption, they will not risk billions of dollars in capital. They will take their factory to a country with transparent courts and predictable regulations.
So the corruption essentially repels the very capital needed to save the economy.
Exactly. Why is the solar transition stalled at 0%? Because transitioning a national energy grid requires incredibly nimble, forward-thinking policy.
And clear contract.
Yes, transparent contracting with independent power producers, and a willingness to dismantle entrenched state monopolies. Institutional rigidity makes that kind of agile reform nearly impossible. The system is just too heavy to pivot.
I want to use a biological metaphor here to kind of wrap this up. Think of the Algerian economy as a human body.
Okay, I like this.
The oil wealth is massive caloric intake. The body is consuming huge amounts of energy. But the governance structure, the institutions, they're the enzymes required to break those calories down and build functional muscle.
And the muscle would be the manufacturing sector and human capital.
Exactly. But the enzymes are missing or dysfunctional.
So instead of building muscle,
the body just stores all those calories as fat, the massive foreign exchange reserves. It looks huge and heavy on a scale, but it lacks the actual muscular strength to run a marathon or adapt to a changing environment.
That is a highly accurate representation of the data. The state has the raw wealth, and it has the demographic potential. But the institutional machinery is simply too corroded by bureaucracy and opacity to process that wealth into sustainable, diversified prosperity.
Okay, we've covered an immense amount of ground today. We've traversed over 60 years of macroeconomic history, looking at everything from the violent swings of oil wealth and the eradication of sovereign debt,
to the triumphs in child survival and the lingering shadow of learning poverty.
Let's synthesize this for the listener.
Yeah.
If we look at the entire 1,400 indicator data set, what is the ultimate roadmap it lays out for Algeria's survival? What are the policy conclusions?
The report essentially dictates three non-negotiable pivots.
Okay, number one.
First, while Algeria has achieved baseline macro stability, they survived the crushing debt of the 90s and secured basic biological survival, the first pivot must be an immediate, aggressive energy transition.
The solar panel.
Yes. They must unlock the Sahara's solar potential to stop the rapid depletion of their natural wealth.
They have to stop liquidating the inventory and start harnessing the infinite resource. What's number two?
Second, they must execute a radical overhaul of their regulatory environment. They have to clean those opaque enzymes from the system.
Fix the governance.
They must establish transparent, predictable governance to attract the high-quality, non-oil foreign investment required to build a domestic manufacturing base.
They have to cure the Dutch disease by making it safe and profitable to build things again.
Precisely. And finally, the third pivot. They must activate their dormant social capital.
The missing 50%.
They have to systematically dismantle the logistical, legal, and cultural barriers that are keeping educated women out of the formal workforce. They must trigger a massive productivity dividend before their demographic window closes and the population ages into an unsustainable burden.
It is an incredibly daunting to-do list. I mean, it requires dismantling entrenched power structures and completely rewiring the economy. But I think the most optimistic takeaway from this massive data set is that they actually possess the raw materials to do it. They aren't starting from zero.
No, not at all.
They have the financial surplus, and they have millions of healthy, literate young people.
The transition from a purely rentier, extractive state to a highly productive, diversified state is arguably the most difficult maneuver in modern development economics. But it is entirely mathematically possible if the institutional will is activated.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. I want to leave you listening with a final concept to just mull over. We've spent this time looking at decades of data showing how a country builds itself by pulling immense wealth from deep beneath the earth.
The ultimate 20th century model.
Right, it's the model of prosperity through extraction. You dig a hole, you pump out the value, and you sell it. But as the global economy undeniably, irreversibly moves away from fossil fuels, the very definition of what it means to be a resource-rich nation is fundamentally changing.
That's a profound shift.
So think about this. What if Algeria's true ultimate resource isn't the finite polluting gas buried under the sand, What if it's the infinite blinding sunlight hitting that sand every single day?
And the people.
And far more importantly, what if it's the millions of highly educated, healthy young people walking upon it? Can a nation that was entirely built, funded, and structured on what it extracts successfully pivot to a future built entirely on what it creates?
It will be the ultimate test of their resilience.
That is the billion-dollar question for Algeria and really for the entire developing world in the 21st century. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom deep dive. We hope this gave you that vital shortcut to understanding the incredibly complex reality operating just behind the headlines. Keep questioning the numbers, keep looking for the invisible mechanisms driving the data, and we will see you on the next deep dive.